Hello everyone and welcome to episode 31 of Lead Strong. I'm Steph Hopper. I'm one of the directors of the talent practice at Capfinity, and I'm joined by my fabulous co-director, Celine Floyd. She'll introduce herself shortly. A few words on Capfinity. We're a global business based in various UK locations in the US, in Dublin and in Sydney, Australia. And we've been helping organisations to find candidates, develop employees and transform their business around our USP of strengths-based assessment and development for over 16 years. Celine and I head up the talent practice, and we support organisations to identify and develop their talent all the way through from early careers up to their executive leadership through a market-leading method of strengths. Celine.
Hello, lovely to see you, Steph. And yeah, episode 31, very exciting. A great discussion today. We're talking about CPOs, wonderful chief people officers and the challenges that they're facing. So really looking forward to the conversation. As Steph said, Celine Floyd, the other director of Capfinity's talent practice with a specialism in assessment from talent all the way up to leadership. And as I say, we are joined by Olivia and James today. Thank you to you both for joining us. I wonder if you may just introduce yourselves to the audience. Olivia, I'll come to you first. A bit about your career and why you're passionate about the subject of leadership.
Sure, of course. Thanks so much for having me and asking me to take part. I'm thrilled to join you. So I'm Olivia. I'm a partner in a leading executive search and interim management firm called Eton Partners. Prior to joining here 5 years ago, I was an HR director in a large FTSE, and I now specialise in executive HR appointments all over the world, including at CPO level, of course. I've also got a specialist interest in inclusion and diversity, specifically the relationship between mental health and organisational performance. I've always been fascinated by the subject of leadership and followership, actually. I was a graduate trainee. I landed up managing teams of up to about 200 or 300 people at one point before moving into HR. And so the concept of how do you create a great leader, how do you inspire followership in others, is a really interesting subject for me. And I've worked alongside some amazing and some not so amazing leaders along the way. So I'm really thrilled to be able to participate. Thanks so much for asking me.
Oh, pleasure. And Olivia, I know you've recently published some really fascinating research, so we're hoping to draw on some of those findings in this conversation. Thank you and welcome. And James, hi. Again, a little bit about your career and why you're passionate about the subject of leadership.
Yeah, so hello everyone. I'm James Edgar. I'm currently the Chief People Officer for a company called Sygnature Discovery. So we are a drug discovery company that's PE backed and on a rapid scale up. So we're looking to try and treble revenue and EBITDA over the next 3 years. And so it's been a great project to enter into, and leadership is going to be a key part of that. And I've spent all of my career in HR in one guise or another. More recently in advertising and media, where we created a media company, which was the 5th largest globally. But prior to that, financial services, facilities management and manufacturing. So I've kind of jumped around sector. And I suppose the interest that I have around leadership is, I think I've always been intrigued by, a bit like Olivia. I think it's amazing how much you can glean from bad leaders as well as good leaders in your own journey. And it's definitely been a journey for me, and I don't think I've got there. And I suppose what's made it more interesting recently is just the context that we're operating in. So whether it's COVID or some of the unrest globally, it's really interesting to see how leadership comes to the fore in those circumstances, and really what a good leader looks like seems to evolve and crystallize in those instances. So for me, I think it's one of those debates that keeps giving some richness to it as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you, James. There's certainly been a lot of leadership lessons in the last couple of years, haven't there? So getting into today's topic, the role of chief people officer, I guess, has really shifted in recent years. And, new challenges have been brought on, as they have for all leaders, by the pandemic. But, particularly for the chief people officer, the changes to ways of working, the great realignment, as we call it at Capfinity, a higher focus on looking after employee wellbeing, which I know has always been something that Olivia's really passionate about. And in fact, some research suggests that 70% of HR leaders say this has been one of the most challenging years of their career to date, not only dealing with the personal impact of the pandemic, but the increased responsibility that their roles and the increased focus that their roles have got. But then there's also research by a Deco group that shows that the top people management role is shifting to have a greater focus on technology and data, but also a greater focus on people, culture and change. And so I guess maybe some of the skills that are coming to the fore for a successful CPO might look a bit different. So perhaps, James, I could start with you. I'm just wondering, what challenges do these kind of conflicting focuses present for CPOs, do you feel, at the moment?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think balance is a really hard one to try and strike in a world that seems to be changing incredibly quickly. And I think one of the challenges is trying to find certainty in ambiguity. And actually, I think the CPO role has probably amplified in its importance in a lot of companies because of that additional context. And I think actually, again, you know, what's really struck me through all the uncertainty is, how do you actually get employee voice and connect with employees in a very different way than you had before? And despite technology, the need for humane connection, I think, has come to the fore even more so. And I think the companies that have done that really well actually are the companies that have kind of come out, you know, things like COVID really strongly. And so I think some of this is actually, how do you balance that need for the employee to the needs of the business in a world where actually it's really difficult to try and get some certainty and think too far in advance. And I think a lot of this is actually how we kind of test and learn in this and evolve as we go through some of those challenges. And, you know, I'm very mindful about talking about COVID like it's actually over. I don't think it is. I think we're just going to the next phase. And so I think there's been a big thing, certainly for me, around how do you change the time frame that you might have, you know, traditionally worked to kind of oscillate to a much shorter time frame to work with the stuff that you're having to deal with right now, but almost hold the medium term slightly looser and still have some kind of direction, but know that you're going to have to evolve as you go through that.
Yeah, that's very true. I remember in those early days of the pandemic, you couldn't plan more than a few hours in advance, could you? We were just all watching the world kind of self-implode and not know what tomorrow morning was going to bring, literally. So you're right about those time frames. Olivia, what are your thoughts on some of these challenges that are now presented to CPOs, you know, the kind of conflicting focus?
Well, I think it's a really interesting question, because when I thought about it, I guess the thing that I'm left is why should a technology or a data focus be mean you can't have a focus on the people culture or you know, cultural change? And surely they're both interdependent, complementary concepts. Actually, I think the perfect setup is that the two inform each other, particularly for the chief people officer role. In my view, and obviously I spend a lot of time with clients working through the different contexts of their organisation compared to another organisation, and so what does the right chief people officer profile look for that business at this stage in their journey? But ultimately, when you boil it down, being a brilliant chief people officer is about balancing EQ and IQ. You know, what does our brain tell us and what do our hearts tell us, and what's logical and what's fair? Those things are not always the same answer, and you have to work out how you balance those things. And I think I would view technology and data and culture and people as being very similar. You need both, otherwise you can very quickly spiral into, as you said, a bit of a point of self-destruct. And that's why the people role for me at this point in our kind of, at this point, is becoming so much more important in the eyes of many organisations. We've seen a big raft of new chief people officer roles going into organisations where they've never been before. Because I think through COVID, maybe that's just been an accelerating factor in why the people function is so important in an organisation's journey. And it can be disastrous. I mean, you have to look at P&O as a really good example recently. On the one hand, I think it's a masterclass in change management and, you know, holding people to NDAs and coming up with a creative solution to a problem. On the other hand, my heart is telling me clearly that's not a great way to deal with the people within a business. But for the context of that organisation, rightly or wrongly, what they were able to come up with is a balance of those two things. That's one very public example of the challenges in the chief people officer role is facing whether that's at a macro or micro scale in any month. And the questions that the people function are being asked to answer are not even questions we've never had to answer before, but before 2 years ago, we probably never even thought would ever have to answer. And so I think the journey that the Chief People Officer role and the people function more broadly has gone on over the last two and a half years, probably in the UK since the Brexit decision. These are brand new challenges for that role. And when you're operating outside of your comfort zone for so long, we know whether that's at an individual level or in a functional level, that can become quite stressful and tiring. So I think those are some of the big challenges for the Chief People Officer role at the moment. But for me, it's all about finding the right balance. I don't think you can have one without the other successfully, nor should you.
Absolutely. And Olivia, in terms of the organisations you're working for at the moment, are you seeing a shift in the sort of skill set that's required of a CPO at the moment? Do you feel that's changed in the last couple of years?
I'm not sure the skill sets are changing. I think the emphasis is probably changing. Ultimately, what we saw in our research is Chief People Officers are still, generally speaking, coming out of a generalist HR route. There's some evidence to say that they will probably bring with them spikes in talent, development, reward in some cases, but it's generally contextual to the organisation. So I don't think the fundamental skills that sit within the people function are particularly different, more how you play to those strengths or otherwise within the organisation that I'm hiring for, or that, like James is operating in. So I think maybe some of the emphasis is changing, but it does depend on the organisation. You can look at any of the organisations affected by the strike action this week. Their context is very different, and what they need from their people function and their Chief People Officers is very different than what you might need in a rapid growth tech startup right now. So I'm not sure there are broad changes in the CPO role. It's more about the ability to think about the context in which you're operating.
And what about you, James? Any thoughts there on the sort of skills that you think are critical for CPOs at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Olivia. I think there's different spikes, and I think there's also probably a different way of working than we've had before. So if I think about this balancing of the business needs to employee needs, I think that's always been there. I think actually it's how we do it in a much more EQ way, as Olivia said. I think the use of data and technology is probably shifting the way that we do that right now. And so what I can definitely see something I'm quite keen to drive is this move away from a very homogenous employee message, particularly when we start talking about personalized messaging to clients and consumers. I think there is a shift between expectations of consumer experience to employee experience, and how do we become much more tailored in our approach to communication with and inclusion of our employee group in a way that we've probably not had the same emphasis of before. And I think data helps do that, but I think it's how you use the data and what the insights become. I can see a lot of areas becoming quite keen on gathering data or using data for insights, but there's almost a so what with it. And actually, how do you then kind of balance it to drive through some change and some interactions? And I said before, I think there's a way actually now of much more collaboration and co-creation than I've probably experienced 10, 15 years ago. If I think about the makeup of the teams that I've had, I've purposely looked for people outside of the HR group that had skill sets in data or skill sets in journey planning coming into the HR function, more so now than I have before. And a lot of the work that I might do with the marketing team is very much joint, whereas before I think it was probably a bit more separate. So I think the way that the HR or the CPO then operates within the organisation is shifting a bit. And I think the use of technology has definitely been a shift for the function. And certainly I've felt over the last couple of years the need to keep my skills a bit fresher. And I still think I'm on that journey, if I'm honest, in terms of actually what we can do with data and actually how we harness that much more. Because I think, again, we've got this shift from being reactive to predictive. And that's a big shift when maybe we've lacked investment, or we don't have the right infrastructure, or we don't capture the right data. That's a big change, I think, for us, certainly in the world that I'm in right now.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I think, we're hearing that a lot at the moment. There's this focus on data and insights, isn't there, James? But it's, what is that in service of? And, as you say, the big so what question. And Olivia, it was interesting to hear you talk about the trends that you're seeing around the CPO role. And, we know that we've kind of been pushing, I guess, for people and HR to have a seat at the top table for a long time, haven't we? And it's interesting to see that on the back of COVID, maybe that's been a catalyst for that moving a little bit more quickly.
Yeah, although the research that we carried out looking at, it was specific to the UK market over the last 3 years, for me had some really quite scary stats in it, one of which was that board participation for the Chief People Officer role in new appointments over the last 3 years has moved from 18% down to 11%. So in that very short period, at a time when the CPO role you would think is under the spotlight like no other time, the fact that those roles are much less likely to be sitting on an organisation's executive board, for me is a bit of a shock, and asks some really interesting questions. Some of it, I think, is down to the types of organisations that are hiring Chief People Officers. We've seen a lot of organisations putting those roles in for the first time, and that's a journey from not having an HR function to having one that that maybe is at a more junior level, to maybe working as part of the executive team, and then finally to sitting on a board. So I suspect we may see that kind of course correct over the next couple of years. But it does raise some interesting questions about why, when most of the world seems to accept that, individualizing the experience of the employee, thinking in the context of EQ and IQ, might we be seeing that participation in board level drop? So I'm not sure it necessarily follows that what we think is happening is what's actually happening, at least in the UK market.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, brilliant that you're able to lift the lid on that a little bit and kind of see what's actually going on. And you've both mentioned something which I wanted to just explore a little bit more, actually, is this balance between the needs of employees and the needs of the business. And Olivia, I'm anticipating that you may say that, again, why do they have to be contradictory? I loved your answer to that last one. And it would be good maybe to bring in some of the thinking that we've touched upon and that I know you're both passionate about around inclusion, because we know that talent is coming in really different ways now, returnships, internships, lateral moves, and that is driving diversity within workforces, but also that well-being and feelings and employee emotion is probably more important, arguably, than it's ever been. There was a stat that was interesting around, only 40.2% of organisations are currently running a well-being, programme at the moment. And Olivia, I know you talked about the link between mental health and organisational performance. So I think for a lot of us, it's obvious that they go hand in hand, but we do know it's something that people functions are grappling with, this need to create new guidance and policies that balance those needs, as I said, the needs of employees and the needs of business. So James, just drawing you a little bit more on that in terms of the challenges that's presenting, and I guess how you personally may be balancing it, or how you're seeing it be balanced in other organisations.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I suppose I keep coming back to the why. Why does an organisation want to spend and invest its time in there? Which might sound an odd, and it's not meant to be a callous question, but I see a lot of organisations that talk about creating a wellbeing strategy. But when you really dig into it, I think actually wellbeing goes quite deep into the organisation, and so for me, it's not about a tick box. It actually has to fundamentally drive something in the organisation. So, the work that we're trying to do here, and certainly in a previous company, is, for me, it's about how do you create sustainable performance, and that's the kind of middle ground that allows you to really take the whole of the employee, but also balance the need for the organisation. And what we don't want to do is create a crisis management situation where you have long hours, drive people to burnout, and then have the crash and then recruit. So for me, the sustainable performance angle is a quite interesting one to actually give some legitimacy to well-being. I think the second bit with it is how do you make it both a culture and an environment where it's trusted so you can raise some of those things? I think there's still quite a lot of stigma in raising if you have a particular issue, and actually the sophistication to actually talk about some of the things that people are facing. So suddenly we trip into labels and sound bites of burnout, depression, and that I think stops some of the conversations where it might not be that extreme, or we could avoid it getting to that extremity. And so that becomes a cultural thing, and that's why for me the well-being bit becomes actually quite a holistic view of not only what are you doing in terms of initiatives, but culturally, and how do you hardwire some of this into the organisation is really, really key. And frankly, I think what COVID has taught us is, I think people are looking for that authenticity of leadership and organisation, and it's amazing how quickly you can find out an inauthentic or disingenuous organisation when they have very high levels of outwardly facing good policies, but inwardly facing cultures that are counter to that. And so again, I think this sense of almost outside in, and the transparency that platforms are now creating, means that it's really imperative that companies have to believe it and stand up for it. Actually, I think it can be damaging to put it in place and not do it. And again, the final point I'd say on this, just to bring Olivia in, is also where do you want to be on the continuum? So I see, again, we've done it in terms of mental health first aiders, which is incredibly strong support, but often that's dealing with the problem, not the cause. And so again, how do you kind of track back on the continuum to actually start looking at fundamentally what are we doing in terms of the way we organise work, how we deal with people and communicate with people to avoid it happening in the first place? That's more endemic, and I think that's where it's much more time and effort, but also commitment, and that's where I think it's important.
I would agree with you, James. I think there's a few things I would add. I'm surprised at the number you quoted, Celine, around that many organisations, only that number saying they had a wellbeing strategy. Actually, in my experience, most organisations have some semblance of wellbeing activity, but often it stops at mental health first aid. And for me, and I'm a trained mental health first aider, that's an important symbolic move in an organisation. But despite the fact that I've been a trained mental health first aider for a number of years now, I'm not sure I've necessarily personally impacted my organisation and driven it forward. So it's hard to draw the correlation between the two things. It's a bit like having hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of defibrillators all over your local town, but no hospitals and no education around healthy eating or exercise. And it's a sticking plaster over the problem. For me, though, some of these questions are directly correlating and connected with the subject of leadership. If you have the right leadership in place, inspirational, authentic, clear, visionary, then people will naturally follow. They will feel like they also can, to coin a phrase, bring their whole selves to work, talk about the issues that are causing them to feel like they're not included, or to raise ways that we could do things better inside organisations. And so all of this stuff is inherently connected. Your question was about balancing the needs of the employees and the business. You're right, that is my answer, which is surely we can do both. Surely we can create organisational policies that create the best of both, that this is a mutually beneficial relationship. And I suppose if COVID has brought it home, and Ukraine has really hammered it home, the point that no business can operate as an island in all of this. We could have the most robust balance sheets, the best minds in the world working on our product. If we can't get a little tiny piece of widget that we need from a part of Eastern Europe, or you can't ship something from China to here, then everything starts to fall apart. And I think if there's anything all of this has added is maybe the CPO role in an organisation is needing to become more externally aware, more there's a question around social responsibility too. So not only do I need to think about the wider context that my organisation is operating in and that my people are performing in, but there's also how does my role and my organisation operate in a global context? How do we bring people back into the cities? How do we ask people to come back into the office for a wider purpose rather than just, we want to see them at their desks? There's a broader social context to this chief people officer role than I think there was before. And in many places, organisations are being asked to make political standpoints as well. You look at the US, Roe versus Wade, you're looking at whether or not you're operating in Russia. those are questions that probably the Chief People Officer wouldn't have been asked to answer before. So all of these things together for me it's not just about individual policy, but about how the social construct of our society all fits together through a kind of commercial context. That I'm going back to my point of we're being asked to answer questions we'd never even thought of 3 years ago, let alone had any experience of doing before. And that requires us to be agile and nimble and things that maybe the function isn't necessarily known for being. We have all of the skills to be, by the way, I should say. But I just think that the people function are sometimes seen as being a bit fuddy-duddy and stuck in, trade unions and arguing about terms and conditions.
Yeah, I love that, Olivia. You've got the faith in our profession, which I like that.
I do, but I think you also have to look at some of the other elements that are going on in the wider workforce. I talked about the RMT earlier, and Jodie Briley is doing some amazing work, Pregnant Then Screwed, and she was speaking to the Lords yesterday, I think, about childcare costs. We've got a huge drain in terms of women in our workforce and men who hold primary carer positions in our families because they cannot afford to stay at work. And so we're losing what could potentially be amazing leaders in our workforce, whether they're inside the function or otherwise. I'm a very proud leader in my parenting context, and being a parent has made me a different person at work. And I'm very privileged to be able to stay at work despite having 3 young children. Not everyone has that choice. And back to the societal context of these roles, we have a role to demonstrate leadership in this space, maybe where government is lagging behind. Love it.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, I guess another really fully charged episode. In summary, I think some of the key takeaways from the conversation, one was a point made by James and by Olivia, is the variety of skill sets now in the people function overall. We're not necessarily just hiring people who've got a reward background or a development background. People who've got skill sets maybe in marketing, in technology, in data, are all going to find themselves rolled if they wish one day in the people function. And actually, as Chief People Officer, we've got to be able to draw on those different skill sets to help us succeed. I think at the beginning we talked a lot about the amplification on Chief People Officers and the acceleration of the role that the last few years has really thrown at them. And then there was this sort of point made by Olivia around the interdependence, I guess, of the employee needs and the organisation needs, and how they can inform each other as well. And I loved what we were saying about the wellbeing strategies. We actually had a leader in education on our last episode who was a head teacher. And she actually said, well-being's a lot more than yogurt and yoga. And I thought, never a truer word has been spoken. But I guess what I was thinking there was I loved James's points about, looking at it as how do we maintain sustainable performance? What is the culture we need to create? And both of you made really great points about the type of leader that really enables people to come to work and show up and be their best selves. And then just that final point that Olivia was making around CPOs needing to be more externally aware of what's going on outside of their organisation, within industry, across the globe, because actually so much more is being expected of them. So I'd love to come to each of you for a final word on our topic. James, what's your final thoughts on the challenging role of a CPO?
Yeah, I'd pick up on Olivia's point. I think it's a really good one. I think the need to have an external lens is, ever more required than we've had before. Because it's moving so quickly, and I think the balance of the EQ IQ debate is the real challenge at the nub of most of the stuff that we're doing. And I suppose just not to forget that actually we're leaders ourselves, and it's how we show up every day, and it's that consistency of leadership that will really create the shadow and followership that hopefully we really want.
Absolutely. Thank you, James. Olivia, final word from you.
Yeah, I think I would agree with James. For me, this role is hugely contextual, and maybe it's controversial to say that it's possibly more contextual than others that sit around the board table. The context in which the Chief People Officer role is having to operate is changing day in, day out, even though we're no longer watching the government briefings at 5 o'clock. These things are still changing on a daily basis, and yet we're trying to push the organisation to think about longer term strategic workforce planning over 2, 5, 10 years. What are the skills that we're going to need for the future? that requires a hugely agile mind. And I think it's a really exciting place in the boardroom to be. These are brilliant roles. And I hope that this kind of conversation's got people thinking about how they might want to steer their own development in terms of how do they bring the very best of what they have to offer to their own organisation. For me, the biggest change is around this contextual point. How do I look up and out of my business and see what's coming and predict what I might do in order to impact my organisation over the longer term? But more than anything else, I think we should see the Chief People Officer role as a leader in our business and helping the rest of the board to be the same.
Fantastic. And Celine, final word from you.
I echo Olivia's the last few words you said, Olivia. It's something I'm really passionate about, the people function having a very true and very real role to play in the organisation's leadership. And I was struck, a few of our questions today, Steph, positioned things as, being people or business, data or people. And I've loved how you've both rightly, come back and said, actually, it's, they go hand in hand. And this is about how we leverage and deploy our people and let them flourish, in service of the organisational performance. And that's really what the role is about. So long may that trend continue. And let's hope that it speeds up in terms of having that seat at that top table.
Thank you. We will be back in 2 weeks' time. I think our next episode is on leadership accountability, and we have a guest from Skyscanner and from the NHS. So we look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks' time. Olivia and James, thank you for taking your time out today. Lovely to riff on that subject, and see you very soon.
Thank you.
Thanks all.